Alright my friends, let me show you a typical turn of combat for this character and how much damage we do when we use our burst damage combo, as well as how much damage we do sustained on every turn of combat. I've used one Cloud Giant Elixir for this character just to give ourselves high strength, and before combat begins we're going to cast Righteous Clarity on ourselves to buff our attack rolls and make us more likely to hit, and then we are going to, at 6th level, cast a Spirit Guardians. This character is going to use the necrotic version of Spirit Guardians because enemies can't resist the damage from it. Also, we are using both minimal and suboptimal gear for this combat demo because I wanted to show you how strong it is even without endgame items. We're using an Act 1 weapon and just thematic gear for the character rather than optimal gear because this build operates pretty much independent of items entirely. Now that we've entered turn-based mode, we are going to use a level 4 spell slot to cast Divine Smite on the Oathbreaker Knight. We're doing this manually so we can use both it and our Channel Divinity in the same turn. That's a critical miss. Also, we are using both minimal and extremely suboptimal gear for the character, because I wanted to show that this does not require endgame items in order to be an extremely effective build. We're using an Act 1 weapon and just thematic gear for our armor and other equipment, no rings or anything, so you can see that this build works extremely independently of items and thus fits in any honor mode party. We are now, having entered turn-based mode, going to use a level 4 spell slot to cast Divine Smite directly on the Oathbreaker Knight. We're activating this manually so we can use it and our reaction with our attack in the same turn. And we hit the Oathbreaker Knight. And we're going to activate Channel Divinity Touch of Death in addition to that Smite attack damage. This has done almost 100 damage. The Oathbreaker Knight did pass his saving throw against our Spirit Guardians. That will be less likely if you have save DC gear equipped, so he might be taking 14 more damage, but you can see that our smite attack did a bunch of damage, our weapon attack did a bunch of damage, we added 25 damage with our Channel Divinity, and that's just the start of combat. We can continue to do this every turn and multiple times per turn. Skipping through a couple of our allies' turns here while Gale is just going to heal up, and then we go back to our turn again. Oathbreaker Knight takes a little bit more in the way of Spirit Guardians damage, so let's just drink a haste potion and do the whole thing over again. We're going to cast Divine Smite on the Oathbreaker Knight, and then activate Touch of Death yet again for yet another pile of damage. So we've done about 200 damage in the first round of combat, and that's with no items, pretty much. So you can see how effective this will be, especially when we add even more burst damage in the form of other items to the mix. And we can continue to run around, provide support to our allies with our 6th level spellcasting, and do additional damage with Spirit Guardians. Also, the Oathbreaker Knight's normally resistant to necrotic damage, but we ignore that. Alright, let's get to the build. Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we're building the ultimate Dark Justiciar, using the new Patch 8 subclasses to give this character incredibly powerful divine spellcasting, and some of the highest melee burst damage in the entire game, while remaining true to Shadowheart's lore and her desire to become one of these shadowy warriors of Shar. This character is also very simple both to build and to pilot, and by itself provides most of what a party needs. It has excellent support abilities, very powerful control options, and extremely high burst damage, which is what you require to succeed in honor mode, and because of its resiliency and power, it's very difficult to make mistakes with this character, so no matter your party composition or your experience as an honor mode player, you should be able to use this character to sail very quickly to your golden dice. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Lad Turner for the $10 donation, Tarantula for the $5 twice over and $10, so $20, and Michael Kraus for the $2, as well as Burton Stevens for becoming a channel member. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support, and it really means a lot to me. Thank you so much. Alright, let's get to the build. I'm using Shadowheart as the example character here, because of course this build is inspired in part by her lore and possible story paths, but naturally you can build this as a custom character as well. If you're doing that, what race you pick mostly doesn't matter. This build gets all of its weapon and armor proficiencies from class levels, so racial weapon and armor proficiencies are not important to the build. And because this build is so powerful and so self-sufficient, what race you pick will not have a significant impact on the power level of the build overall. That being said, if you want to optimize further, the best picks are Halfling for their ability to reroll ones, which not only just makes you vastly more stable over a long honor mode run, giving you a huge advantage on all of your checks throughout the entire game, it also specifically makes you better at concentrating on spells, which this build is going to be doing pretty frequently, especially when you're up in the mix and potentially taking damage in melee. Or Wood Elf or Half Wood Elf for the bonus mobility, because this build will often want to run away from enemies to fry them with magic, and often want to close the distance with enemies in order to smash them with weapon attacks, and the bonus mobility helps you both leave and enter combat faster. At first level, we're going to be starting with a level of Paladin. Now, of course, if you want to stick strictly to Shadowheart's lore, you can leave her as a cleric up until the point where she becomes a Dark Justiciar, and then respec into this build, or use one of my other lore-friendly guides for her up to that point. But either way, when you begin building her as the Dark Justiciar, you're going to want to start with Paladin. There's two main reasons for this. Firstly, you get heavy armor proficiency, which is very helpful for this character, because Paladin gets heavy armor proficiency naturally if you take it at first level, but if you multi-class into Paladin later, it only gives you medium armor proficiency. And because we're taking Death Domain Cleric as our Cleric domain, that gets martial weapons but not heavy armor. So starting as a Paladin will allow us to gain heavy armor proficiency. The second is a quirk of how Baldur's Gate handles save DCs for spells and items. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then don't worry about it, just follow the level order given in this guide and you'll be just fine, but we want to take Cleric second as our second new class in order to make sure that we use Wisdom if we ever cast a spell from a scroll or activate an item. For our Paladin Oath, what oath we take here is actually not incredibly important. So if you feel that taking the Oath of Vengeance or breaking your oath and becoming an Oathbreaker fits the character better and fits your vision for your playthrough better from a flavor standpoint, that will not significantly harm the character. However, for this build, we're going to be using Oath of the Crown, because Oath of the Crown gives us by far the best Channel Oath ability at level 1, making it the best level 1 dip, or 1 or 2 level dip for a Paladin. Righteous Clarity is an incredible ability both to cast on our allies and on ourselves, giving a bonus equal to our proficiency bonus to our attack rolls or to an ally's attack rolls. That lets this character support an ally for dealing damage or land our incredibly powerful melee attacks much more reliably when we want to use those. So we can immediately begin using our character's abilities to the maximum extent if we have Righteous Clarity. Hitting with our attacks is going to be really important for this character because we won't get a lot of them. We need to make sure that they count. So having the attack roll bonus makes us much, much better at using them. Oath of the Crown, therefore, is the strongest Paladin Oath for us and the one that we're going to take for this build. For our ability score selection, we have two different and somewhat competing goals that we need to manage. We need high strength, or high dexterity if we're okay using finesse weapons, in order to make our melee attacks, which are very powerful, so we want to be able to do that. And we need high wisdom in order to be able to use our spellcasting in the most effective way. There's a couple different ways that we can manage to do this. We can either just accept that our other attributes are going to be lower and take both high strength and high wisdom as our natural attributes, or we can use one of the attribute replacement items that Baldur's Gate 3 gives us, either the Gloves of Dexterity or the Elixirs of Hill Giant Strength, in order to set that attribute higher while taking low numbers on our character sheet. For this build, I'm going to be using Elixirs of Hill Giant Strength. They make the build as strong as possible, but I will show you both different attribute spreads, so if you prefer not to use the Strength Elixirs, you can still build this character without them, and it will be just fine. For the non-Elixir version of the build, we're going to be taking 16 Strength, a 16 in Wisdom, and 14 in Constitution, and 12 in Dexterity. This is much lower dexterity than I usually recommend. This build will be able to get away with it in the early game because we are pretty tanky, so losing initiative isn't the end of the world for this character, but it definitely will make the early game quite a bit harder if you're going for the non-Elixir version of the build. Later in the game, you'll be able to repair your initiative using items like the Elixir of Vigilance, the Gloves of Dexterity to just give ourselves 18 dexterity, or other initiative boosting gear, and at that point the build will not be at a significant disadvantage compared to the Hill Giant Elixir version, but the early game will definitely be quite a bit harder. For the elixir version of the build, we get to drop strength entirely because we're going to be drinking an elixir of hill giant strength and replacing this 8 with a 21 every day. So we don't need to put any points into strength at all. And that lets us get away with the greediest possible attribute distribution in the game. We'll take 17 in wisdom, 16 in dexterity, and 15 in constitution. This is the highest we can get 3 attribute points, and I recommend taking 16 in dex over 16 in con in the early game, because initiative is just that important, and we won't have heavy armor yet, so it will probably let us get a few more points in armor class, depending on exactly what armor set we're using in the early game. When we get our first feat, we're going to take an ASI and even these odd numbers out. If the odd numbers bother you in the early game, you can do something like this, though of course the 12 in strength here won't matter, because we're going to be drinking an elixir every game, and when you get your first feat, you definitely are going to want to respec in order to get the most constitution and wisdom that you possibly can. Our skills and background with this character pretty much doesn't matter. We are not going to be the party face or picking locks, so generally speaking, we're not going to be making a lot of skill checks throughout the game, so you can pick whatever skills you want here for flavor. Maybe medicine makes sense, religion, of course, and insight makes sense for Shadowheart, so this is something that I might consider from a flavor standpoint, but these skills will not matter from a gameplay perspective. Alright, that's all the decisions we have to make at level 1. Let's move on to level 2. At character level 2, we're going to immediately leave Paladin and take a level of Cleric. Of course, we could take our second level of Paladin to get smites right away, but I want to get our higher level Cleric spells online as soon as possible, and this also makes us stronger in the early game with the very powerful early game Death Domain Cleric abilities. So not only does this smooth out our level progression, it lets us reach our very strong 3rd level spell Power Spike much sooner, and Death Domain Cleric, as you'll see, gets an ability that basically replaces Paladin Smites up until the point when we want to be doing both in the same turn. So while there's some flexibility with when we take our second Paladin level, I recommend taking levels of Cleric now to get our Power Spikes as smooth and as quickly as possible. For our Cleric domain, of course, we are going to be taking Death Domain Cleric. It fits very fitting for a Dark Justiciar, and also which gives us some very powerful abilities. The first of these is the Reaper ability that lets our necromancy cantrips that only target one creature target an additional creature. This used to let you double target the same creature, but they have patched that, so it's only 2 different creatures, but that's still a huge amount of damage in the early game with something like Toll the Dead or Bone Chill. For our cantrip selection from our special Death Domain cantrip, we're going to be taking Bone Chill. This is not available to clerics normally, so Toll the Dead we're going to be picking up just from our cleric cantrip list, and Bone Chill is an incredibly useful ability to have. It lets you target the enemy's armor class as opposed to a saving throw, so a lot of enemies you're going to have an easier time hitting with Bone Chill, and remember we can hit multiple targets with it, and also it's extremely good against undead and enemies that heal, so there's a lot of encounters, especially some encounters that Shadowheart is deeply involved in, where Bone Chill is extremely powerful. For our normal cleric cantrips, not the special ones that we get from Death Domain, we're going to be taking Guidance. Every party should have access to this spell, so you should pretty much always take it when a character has the option to. Toll the Dead, which is now available to every cleric and gives us an amazing damage option. And for our last cantrip here, you have a couple different choices. You can take a utility spell like Light. You can take Bursting Sinew if you want to try to use the Corpse Explosion AoE option. I haven't found this to be incredibly useful in-game, but it is really fun to have the Corpse Explosion on a cantrip. Or Blade Ward because we're going to be up in melee combat. In general, I'm going to say that the most powerful option for this character is Blade Ward. We're going to be surrounded by enemies pretty frequently, and sometimes you just need to buy your team time to get to you and help you out. Casting Blade Ward can cause multiple enemies to effectively take half a turn, so if you spend your turn to block half a turn from each of 4 enemies who then hit you and do half damage, then that's action economy positive. Blade Ward's not a great spell to normally spend your turn on, because if you spend a turn and an enemy attacks you for half damage, then you've done nothing with your turn and they've still gotten half a turn. But if multiple enemies waste their turn on the Blade Ward attack, then it's good, and it can be great in emergencies, so very useful to have for any character that wants to be in melee. Also very good to help you maintain concentration on your spells. And finally, for our prepared spells at this level, we're going to be taking the classic cleric mainstays of Healing Word to get our allies up if they get knocked unconscious, Command, because that stops enemies in their tracks and is one of the best spells in the game just to win fights outright, Sanctuary for a great emergency option as well as to cheese enemies, keep your allies safe in emergencies or run away from combat if things start to go wrong, and Bless, which is just a great buffing spell for your entire party. We will later be taking Inflict Wounds, but at this level we don't have a particular synergy with it. That happens at next level, so let's go ahead and level up and take another level of Cleric. At character level 3, we're going to be taking our second Cleric level, which gives us the Channel Divinity Touch of Death ability. This is what this build is built around. Touch of Death is an incredibly strong ability that's very easy to overlook. How this works is it lets you spend your Channel Divinity, available once per short rest at this level, later we'll get a second charge of it, in order to deal extra damage when you hit an enemy with a melee attack. This melee attack can either be a weapon attack or an unarmed attack, or any spell that uses a melee attack roll. So in this case, we're going to prepare Inflict Wounds so that we can use this with a melee attack roll, and then activate Channel Divinity Touch of Death. When you hit an enemy with this ability, it lets you add extra damage equal to 5 plus double your cleric level. So at this level, we're adding 9 extra damage to our attacks. So Inflict Wounds is normally 3d10 damage, right? Which is an average of 16.5 damage. So we're basically adding 50% more damage to that spell. In fact, a little more than 50% damage more to that spell. Or an average of 1 Paladin Smite every time we activate Channel Divinity Touch of Death. We can use this in the same turn as Paladin Smites if we activate one and use the other as a reaction, giving us incredibly high melee burst damage once we get access to both of those abilities. But even in the short term, this gives us a huge amount of damage in the early game while we're running around in heavy armor, frying things with Inflict Wounds, and being basically unkillable thanks to our very, very high stats. Of course, none of this comes at the cost of our Cleric spellcasting, so let's level up to Cleric level 3 and get second level Cleric spells, where we get yet another huge power spike. The second level spell slots that we get access to not only give us access to second level Cleric spells, including Blindness, which is a pretty relevant spell from Death Domain. This targets enemies' Constitution saves, which is typically a pretty bad save to target. Enemies will usually have high Constitution saves. But, of course, some enemies have low con saves, and you can hit them with Blindness. And also, you can lower it in various ways, like by giving enemies Bleeding or Reverberation to reduce their con save and apply Blindness. If you can reliably land this spell, it's a pretty good debuff. Not a spell that I would use that often, but sometimes it will be your best option in fights. For our prepared spells at this level, we're going to add in Spiritual Weapon. Normally, I would also add in Hold Person, but for this character, we're going to be spending a lot of our second level spell slots just upcasting Inflict Wounds for 4d10 damage, and then also using our Channel Divinity. And of course, commanding multiple creatures, and so on. So, Spiritual Weapon gives us a great option to distract enemies, add a little extra damage over time, but our second level spell slots are often just going to be burst damage or powerful control options on multiple enemies with command, while maintaining all of our utility spells, letting us protect and assist our party in extremely powerful ways. Remember, of course, that we also, in addition to Bless, have the Paladin buff from Oath of the Crown Paladin, so we can give our allies a d4 plus 2 to their attack rolls, which means that pretty much every ally, even if they don't have great attack rolls, is going to hit every attack at this level, making this character an excellent supporting character as well as dishing out incredible burst damage. At level 5, we're going to take another level of Cleric to get access to our first feat, and with our feat, we are going to, as promised, take an ability score improvement to even out our Wisdom and Constitution. You could also, at this level, take Alert, and I certainly would not be opposed to that decision either. Alert is always excellent in Honor mode. We have taken 16 Dexterity, and we will be able to use it, some Initiative gear for this character, so it's not as required, but you can never go wrong taking that. And if your Initiative gear is better on another one of your party members, you can take Alert with this character, and then use spell save DC to make up for having slightly lower wisdom, or give them Ethel's Hair to boost their wisdom to 18, and then take an ASI to boost their wisdom up to 20 later. Either of those work just fine. So ASI is sort of the default, but if your initiative gear is better on another character, just grab Alert with this one. We also get another cantrip, and for our cantrip selection, I'm just going to recommend taking Light. You can also take Bursting Sinew if you want it for flavor, but Light is just such good utility, especially in Act 2, that every party should pick it up. Resistance is also good. There's a couple events coming up where you will want to have high saving throws for story events, so you can take Resistance and use that to boost it if you don't have access to it elsewhere in your party. At character level 6, we're going to take our 5th level of Cleric to get the extremely powerful 3rd level spell, Power Spike. This is where most casters get their best and most impactful spells, and Cleric is no exception. In fact, it's probably the one that gets the most important spells when it hits level 5. This gets us access to Spirit Guardians, Mass Healing Word, so we can use the buff on heal items, as well as Glyph of Warding, all of which are going to be incredibly powerful options for our Cleric. We also get Animate Dead from being a Death Cleric, which gives us the option to use summons, and that's summons are always great in Baldur's Gate, so having a few zombies running around to support your character is, of course, an excellent option as well. For our prepared spells at this level, I'm going to recommend that you add in Glyph of Warding and Spirit Guardians. Mass Healing Word, if you're using the buff on heal item set, is useful to apply all of those buffs at once. Otherwise, I would put in Hold Person, or you could go back for Guiding Bolt if you want a ranged damage option that costs a spell slot. But because we have both Toll the Dead and Bone Chill, we don't really need the ranged damage, so generally I'm going to prefer to take the Control option here, or Mass Healing Word to apply those buffs. Then, at character level 7, the full combo comes online. Of course, this character has been very powerful up until this point. We're just a cleric, which is an excellent thing to be, running around frying enemies with our Spirit Guardians, commanding enemies to lie down, or blowing them up with Glyphs of Warding is a very powerful combat strategy, in addition to all the extra damage we get from being a Death Cleric. But let's add even more damage by taking a 2nd level of Paladin and getting Divine Smite. At this level, we have 3rd level spell slots, so we can spend one of those for 4d8 extra damage on a melee weapon attack. That is 18 average damage, or 36 average damage on a critical hit. Add to that our Channel Divinity Touch of Death, which at this level is 5 plus 2 times our Cleric level for 15 more damage, and we get 33 average damage on a normal hit, or 51 average damage, in addition to whatever our weapon does and any other bonuses that we have, on a critical hit. That's a huge amount of damage to add to an attack at this level. So if an enemy is low, and they will be because we're doing constant damage with our cantrips, which double target, with our Spirit Guardians, which is chipping away at enemy HP, and of course our allies' very accurate weapon attacks, thanks to all of our buffing, we have the means to finish off enemies as soon as they get within range extremely reliably. The melee burst damage gives this character a finality to just end combats, so a finishing move, Mortal Kombat style, after we have gained a huge advantage in the fight just from being an extremely powerful caster. We also get a fighting style, and here we have another choice to make depending on what weapon we want to use throughout the game. Great Weapon Fighting style is very good for Paladin smites. The damage die on the smite also gets rerolled with Great Weapon Fighting style if you roll a 1 or a 2, so it makes your smite damage significantly more consistent. But if you aren't using a two-handed weapon, obviously the Great Weapon Fighting style is not going to be particularly useful. In that case, I'd just take defense to increase your armor class, though protection is fun and I think generally underrated. So if you're using a one-handed weapon and shield, then you could take protection, and you could also just take dueling in order to do 2 extra damage on every attack and add more consistent damage to your character. So Great Weapon Fighting if you're using a two-handed weapon. Any one of these other 3 are great if you're using a one-handed weapon, and I recommend that you take whichever you want for flavor. Obviously, Shar's Spear, you will probably be using one-handed alongside a shield, so if you're using the Spear of Evening, then dueling or defense are probably your best options. Here we're going to take Great Weapon Fighting just because of its synergy with Paladin smite attacks. For our spells for Paladin, we are going to be taking, not Wrathful Smite, Thunderous Smite, because this gives us an alternative. If we're out of Channel Divinity charges, so we can't activate Touch of Death, we can use Thunderous Smite and a Paladin Smite with a spell slot in the same attack, which will give us an additional 2d6 thunder damage, as well as the normal smite damage on top of our damage output, so it lets us effectively double smite more times, since this character is all about smiting several times in a turn, or several times on a single attack. Then, at character level 8, we're going back to Cleric. This gives us 4th level spell slots, because we have 6 casting levels from Cleric, and then 1 from Paladin for 7 total casting levels, so we unlock 4th level spells. That lets us use the max level spell slot on smites for 5d8 damage for a smite attack, and every Cleric level that we take increases our Touch of Death damage by 2, so we've gone from 15 to 17 on that. That makes our burst damage turns even more powerful, because we now have 5d8 smite damage and 17 Touch of Death damage. In addition to that, we get an extra channeled divinity charge for being a 6th level Cleric, so now we can use Touch of Death twice per short rest. That's 17 damage, so that's 34 times 3 short rests is, 102 damage per day? That's a pretty solid amount of extra damage per day that we're just getting from that ability, more if we have a bard. And we can use this multiple times in a turn even if we use a speed potion or other form of haste. So we could do multiple smites and multiple touches of death in order to do an enormous amount of burst damage if we just really want one enemy dead. In addition to that, enemies are now, we now ignore resistance to necrotic damage. There's a lot of enemies, especially in Act 2, that are resistant to necrotic damage, so this means that our Touch of Death is much, much more reliable. There's also a bunch of enemies who are not vulnerable to radiant damage in the game, and that means that we get to use the secret second mode of Spirit Guardians with this character. Spirit Guardians for necrotic damage is actually a pretty valuable tool on Death Domain Cleric. Normally, you would almost always go with radiant damage on Spirit Guardians, because so many enemies resist or ignore necrotic damage, and radiant damage lets you use radiating orbs and all of the benefits that that has. But for Death Domain Cleric, the unresistible necrotic damage gives you a very, very consistent damage source with Spirit Guardians. So don't neglect to use this tool in addition to the burst damage. That gives you great sustained damage with Spirit Guardians and great burst damage, of course, with our burst damage combo, as well as all the support from being a cleric. At character level 9, we're going to take our 7th level of Cleric to get access to 4th level Cleric spells. Not only does this give us the very solid Cleric 4th level spell list, it gives us access to Blight, which Cleric normally doesn't get, but as a Death Domain Cleric we do. Blight isn't typically a very exciting spell, but for this character it's great, because enemies can't resist the damage, it's necrotic damage, and a weapon that we can strongly consider using for this character is the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. Remember that you can attack with staffs, so even if you are using something like Mark of Heshkir or the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, you can benefit from all the bonuses it gives your spellcasting, and then still attack with that weapon for your burst damage combo. You get to use the secret second mode of the staff, so the Staff of Cherished Necromancy can let you spam free blights and then also still make melee attacks. For our prepared spells at this level, we are going to, it completely rewrote the prepared spell list, so let's just fix that real quick. We're going to be taking Healing Word, Command. By this point, you probably have other sources of Bless and don't want to spend your concentration on it, so you can drop that from your level 1 list. Inflict Wounds is still very good to upcast. We're going to grab Hold Person and Spiritual Weapon at level 2, Glyph of Warding, Spirit Guardians, and then Mass Healing Word if we're using the buff on heal items from level 3. And then from level 4, we will take Banishment and Guardian of Faith. Freedom of Movement is also pretty nice to have. Banishment is really good against certain enemies, so if you know you're not facing an enemy with a weak Charisma save, then you don't need to prepare Banishment, but there are enemies in the game who basically can't succeed against this spell because they have low charisma saves, so it just wins you some encounters outright. Guardian of Faith, I think, is a pretty underrated spell. This summon does a lot of damage. It's sort of a summon, sort of an area control spell. It does a lot of damage for a level 4 spell slot. It's 60 damage for the spell slot, which is a good ratio, and it's gigantic, so it lets you block doorways and stuff as well. Freedom of Movement is also a good panic button to be able to have in your back pocket, so if there's one of these spells you're not using, Freedom of Movement is great. If an ally gets stunned, then you can cast Freedom of Movement to break them out of it, which can save you if you get into a real pinch. Then, at character level 10, we're taking our 8th level of Cleric, which also gets us 5th level spell slots. Now, we can use this either to upcast something like Aid at the beginning of the Adventuring Day, or we can upcast Spirit Guardians to 5th level. You don't get a benefit for smiting with a 5th level spell slot, so we don't need to use our smites on that, but we can use it for Spirit Guardians or upcasted Inflict Wounds for even more burst damage. We also get Divine Strike Necrotic, which allows us to do an extra d8 damage on all of our weapon attacks. Normally for Death Clerics, this is not a particularly useful ability because they aren't using weapon attacks, but this character is, the Dark Justiciar is, so the extra d8 of damage is just even more damage on all of your attacks. Now, the way that Divine Strike Necrotic is coded in Baldur's Gate makes it actually kind of hard to use for this character, because it's coded as a reaction to hitting with your attack. You then activate this ability separately, or you manually select it, so it uses the same interface as Smites or as Channel Divinity Touch of Death. That means that because of this UI problem, we can't use all 3 abilities in the same turn, so you don't get the extra d8 necrotic damage on a turn where you're both using Touch of Death and a Smite, which is kind of annoying, but it's still a pretty useful ability that adds a bunch of extra sustained damage to your character. For our feat, we are of course just taking an ability improvement to boost our wisdom to 20, though if you are using a lot of spell save DC gear and are having trouble concentrating on your spells, you can take Warcaster. Warcaster just giving you concentration advantage will make it easier if you find you're taking a lot of damage and losing concentration on Spirit Guardians frequently, or Alert, of course, is always good for Honor Mode and remains good even this late in the game. At character level 11, we're continuing to level in Cleric, getting access to Cloudkill. Now, this character doesn't get Hero's Feast, but if you have Hero's Feast elsewhere in your party, that makes you immune to poison, so you can stand inside your own Cloudkills and fight enemies while they take damage and you don't, which makes it a pretty powerful tool. It also, if you can keep an enemy locked in this is just a lot of damage over time, so a really nice spell to have. Mostly we're leveling up, though, just to get higher level spell slots in order to upcast Spirit Guardians, upcast commands, use higher level Inflict Wounds if we really want that melee burst damage. So just continuing to level in Cleric gets us the better spell slots overall. A variant for this build is instead of taking the last 3 Cleric levels, we could take 3 more Paladin levels and get extra attack, which would let us make more melee attacks. But this character's sustained melee damage isn't that good. We're using the melees mostly for burst damage, so we prefer, in general, the higher level spell slots, but you could take a more even split, and it would be very good as well. For our prepared spells at this level, there's nothing in particular that we want to bring in from level 5. Cloudkill is probably the best concentration spell, but Flame Strike can be a decent AoE burst damage option, so you can prepare that. Mostly, though, you're going to be going back to grab utility spells from earlier levels, things like Freedom of Movement that give you a great panic button, or things like Aid, which you can use to upcast with your higher level spell slots in order to give your whole party a huge amount of hit points for the entire day. By this point in the game, you should have a pretty good sense of what your party is missing, and go back and grab spells accordingly in order to fill those needs. And finally, at character level 12, we're taking our 10th level of Cleric and getting our 6th level spell slot. Now, we don't have 6th level spells, but because we're a 10th level Cleric, that gives us 10 casting levels, and then 2 Paladin levels give us 1 more casting level. So we count as an 11th level caster and get a 6th level spell slot. We can use this, of course, on an upcasted Spirit Guardians, an upcasted Aid, an upcasted Inflict Wounds. Usually, you're going to use it on an upcasted Spirit Guardians for a really powerful Spirit Guardians, but just having more spell slots gives us more smites and more options in combat throughout the entire game. We get a cantrip. Tragically, cannot take True Strike to annoy people in the comments, so let's just take Bursting Sinew because it's fun, and you might be able to do something funny with it in the late game by piling up a bunch of corpses and exploding them one by one to just really annoy the NPCs in Baldur's Gate. Alright, my friends, that is the build for the Dark Justiciar, but of course we can make this character more powerful with items, so let's talk about those. 4 items for this character. We actually don't need that much specific in the way of specific items in order to function at full effectiveness. This character, of course, needs one stat item, either the Gloves of Dexterity or an Elixir of Hill or Cloud Giant Strength, so we drink this every day in order to set our strength to 20. The Gloves of Dexterity would let us, instead of taking 16 dex, take 16 strength instead. It'll lower your hit chance bonus. By the way, the non-elixir build, you still want to max wisdom. You will still hit with your melee attacks when you need to because you have the paladin hit bonus from Righteous Clarity, which gives you a +4 to hit, so even with only 16 strength, you're going to hit with your attacks pretty regularly. This character also benefits tremendously from Potions of Speed, even more so than most characters, because it lets you use your burst damage combo multiple times in one turn. So if you need to hit with multiple Channel Divinity Touch of Deaths and multiple smites in a turn, drinking a Potion of Speed lets you do that. Boosts to our spell save DC and initiative, like from the Fistbreaker Helm, are extremely important. Initiative and save DC are the most important stats for any caster, and we're a caster, so the items like the Fistbreaker Helm that give us extra initiative, items like the Sentinel Shield that give us extra initiative are very good, and items like the Fistbreaker Helm or Markahesh gear that boost our spell save DC are incredibly valuable. For our weapons, in the early game, the Staff of Arcane Blessing is actually very good for this character, because unlike most clerics, we actually make spell attack rolls pretty frequently, because we're going to be using Inflict Wounds, which is a melee attack roll, but a spell melee attack roll. So having Arcane Blessing, we get an extra 2d4 to our hit chance with our Inflict Wounds, which means we almost always hit with Inflict Wounds unless we crit fail. So that just makes the character extremely reliably if you're using this and then blessing yourself. Two other late game staffs are really, really good. Markahesh gear, just like for every single spellcaster in the game, is probably the best overall, giving you refreshes to your spell slots and letting you cast Chain Lightnings every short rest for incredible amounts of damage. But the Staff of Cherished Necromancy is also amazing for this character. Still a +2 weapon, so you can hit with attacks with it very well, and you can use it in combination with a shield, like the Sentinel Shield, in order to have high initiative, and the Staff of Cherished Necromancy going off. And this gives you free casts of spells of necromancy spells, including Blight, or higher level Inflict Wounds, which lets you do a ton of damage without spending spell slots. So the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, incredibly valuable for this character, and I would consider it the best in slot weapon. Of course, if you want to play a more thematic version, then any two-handed weapon can work. Shar's Spear of Evening is the best, as it is for pretty much every character. In the earlier game, I like the Soulbreaker Greatsword because it gives you bonus initiative, and then in the late game, this character can use pretty much any two-handed weapon that's not required by another party member. Your actual weapon doesn't matter that much, it's that you're wielding it in two hands to trigger Great Weapon Master so that you can get the rerolls on your smite damage. Finally, of course, as a cleric, you have access to all the Radiating Orb gear, the Luminous Armor, plus the Coruscation Ring, Callous Glow Ring will let you inflict a bunch of Radiating Orbs on enemies with your Spirit Guardians when you set it to Radiant damage, and we're a Paladin as well, so we're doing Radiant damage with our smites, so the Radiating Orb gear is incredibly powerful for this character, and then you can combine that with the Boots of Stormy Clamor and the Gloves of Belligerent Skies in order to deal a bunch of reverberation alongside of your Radiating Orb effects. As always, Radiating Orbs are incredibly broken, so this is the most powerful setup for the character, is the Radiating Orb build, but you can also just be in heavy armor and wade into the front of combat. A thematic piece of armor like the Reaper's Embrace or the Dark Justiciar Halfplate is actually really fun for the character as well, and will not significantly compromise you, though the Radiating Orb stuff is stronger, because it's just always stronger. Finally, bonuses to your critical hit chance, like the Dark Justiciar Helmet, are really good for this character as well, because that just means more critical smites, so any bonus to your crit chance and any automatic criticals, like from the Luck of the Far Realms Illithid power, are incredibly valuable for this character. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the Dark Justiciar, and I hope that it helps your Shadowhearts or custom characters bring darkness to the land in the name of Shar. I've found this build incredibly fun to pilot. Being a cleric with such extremely high levels of burst damage like this character has just makes so many combats so much more fun and satisfying, because you just get to wipe enemies in one turn or control the battlefield and do all of the normal things that clerics do so incredibly well. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit that like button. I appreciate you taking the time to do that, because it really does help out with the algorithm when people interact with the videos. YouTube pays a lot of attention to that, so it really does mean a lot to support creators if you push buttons on YouTube. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.